Bubets. Like you, everyone, I can wait to see this symposium begins. Thank you. Back to you, Bubet.
Thank you. Thank you, Irfan. Next, we're going to have Jeffrey Winters. He's the director of the EDGES program at Northwestern University. He's going to give a few words.
Good morning to everybody here in the US. I think we have some people joining from Europe, perhaps Australia, and then of course it's Saturday night in Indonesia, and we have a bunch of people who don't have very exciting lives because here they are at a symposium on a potentially exciting Saturday night. So welcome. We will try to be your exciting entertainment. At the very least, we'll stimulate you intellectually and hopefully we'll have a great time. First, I want to thank Beth very much for organizing this, putting it together. Thank you so much. This is the second time that we are doing the symposium virtually. And the reasons for that are obvious. Normally what happens is prior to doing it virtually, all of the symposia were held first at Northwestern, where we would gather and do a trial run. And then we would do it again, roughly a month later in Jakarta before a very large live audience. So the reason I'm telling you this is because in the past, all of the presenters have had a chance to present, practice, get lots of feedback, refine their work, and then present it again in a revised form. But last year and this year, the format is one time for both the Northwestern presentation and Indonesia simultaneously, so no practice. This is just straight up direct presentation. That's not to say that it won't be as good. We happen to have such talented people presenting that they don't need a practice run. They can do it the first time brilliantly. I don't say that to all of you to put pressure on you, of course, the ones who are presenting. But anyway, we're doing it one time. Starting next year, COVID permitting, and assuming Indonesia makes a lot of progress in managing the pandemic, we expect that we're once again going to be doing the two-side presentation format. That's our hope. So let's look forward to that. Couple other quick things before we get right to the presentations, which is what all of you have really come here for. I want to make a couple of announcements which are very important. One is I want to thank ISRSF's board, a committed group of people who have really done a great job over the last decade. I want to thank the outgoing director, Ridarson Galingging, who served the foundation beautifully. And I want to thank our incoming and new board director, Pa Irfan Hutagalung. And every year we also thank our very generous benefactors and donors who have made this scholarly endeavor possible. And we look forward to their continued support in the future. And then finally, I just want to say a little bit, a quick word to show how proud we are of the Arryman scholars. Every year, this group of scholars achieves all kinds of terrific things. They win awards, they win independent scholarships, various kinds of recognitions. We have a bunch of those this year already in 2021. I'm not going to mention all of them, but I'm only going to mention three, just to give you an idea of the kind of achievements these students that we're very proud of have made. So first, I'm going to mention that Rahadika Utama in the sociology department just won. We found out about this just a few days ago. He won the 2021 Hayward Alker Best Student Paper Award at the American Political Science Association, APSA, which is kind of interesting. He's in sociology, but he won a national political science competition. That competition for that award is against everyone who is in the American Political Science Association across the country. So he was competing not only with other Northwestern graduate students, but graduate students all over. The title of his paper, The Politics of Memory, Underdevelopment, and Remnants of Political Violence in the Sumatra Rubber Belt. And that work that he won, the paper that he won the award for, is also part of his dissertation. And you will be seeing Dika at the next Arryman Symposium, I'm sure. So congratulations to Dika on that really, really terrific award. I also want to mention Sari Ratri, who is in the anthropology department. Sari won a $20,000 Wenner Gren Foundation grant to support her dissertation fieldwork on her project entitled Nourishing the Future, the Roles of Midwives in Indonesia's Changing Health Development Policies. I should mention that the Wenner Gren Foundation grant is the highest award, most prestigious award that someone can win in the field of anthropology. Again, nationally, across the United States, people do compete every year for the Wenner Gren Foundation. It's a really tremendous recognition. And then finally, Sari Ratri again, and Wara Urwasi, one of our presenters tonight, this morning, were both awarded the Northwestern Buffett Institute Global Impacts Graduate Fellowship for 2021-2022 academic year. This fellowship is also very prestigious. It comes with a very generous stipend and supports them throughout the year. So I could actually keep going. There are many, many more of these, but I thought that those three really stood out, and I'd like to congratulate those achievements. And so thank you all for your hard work and for the, and we're really glad you're getting the recognition you deserve for that work. So congratulations. It makes all of us very proud. So with that, we are now going to, I'm going to turn it back over to Beth. I thank all of you for coming, and we are really looking forward to listening to the presentations. I'll say only one more thing, which is Gde is going to be presenting his completed dissertation work. And the other presenters for what we're calling the Research Roundtable, they are all still in the field. When COVID hit, all of them were conducting their doctoral field research. And you can imagine that as whole countries shut down, one of the hardest things to do is to run around and do research. You can just imagine the difficulties that that entails. These graduate students have persevered despite those challenges. They have collected data, and partly what you're going to hear today is how they've adapted in the field to doing their projects despite the challenges that COVID presents and the pandemic presented to all of us in so many ways. Most of us were staying home or trying to stay home. They were trying to go out into the field despite these difficulties, very challenging. So we congratulate them for their perseverance, and we look forward to their presentations today. Back to Beth, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Hi, everyone. My name is Beth Morrissey. I'm the Assistant Director of the Arryman Scholars Initiative, and just want to welcome you all for coming here today to the symposium. Just wanted to let you know that it's being recorded, and we just ask if you please keep yourself on mute while the presenters are speaking. There will be time for Q&A, and to participate in the Q&A, you can use the raise hand function and we'll call on you. You can also enter questions into the chat function and we can read those out when it's time for Q&A. And so to begin, I'm going to introduce our first Arryman Scholar who is going to be speaking on his dissertation research. I want to introduce you to Arryman Scholar Dr. Gde Metera. He's a 2021 graduate from Northwestern University with a PhD in political science. Gde is going to be presenting a chapter from his dissertation, which is entitled Coercion in Search of Legitimacy, the Secular State, Religious Politics, and Religious Coercion in Indonesia under the New Order, 1967 to 1998. And he's going to be speaking on a chapter from his dissertation, and that chapter is entitled The Struggle Over Symbolic Power Resource, the New Order's Accommodation to Religious Politics, 1978 to 1983. So Gde is going to speak for about a half an hour, and then he's going to have a respondent, and I'm just going to quickly introduce his respondent, who is Testriono Mohammed. He's a professor at the State Islamic Institute in Jakarta, and he's an editor for the journal Studia Islamica. And he's also a PhD candidate in political science at Northern Illinois University. So we look forward to hearing from him after Gde speaks. So Gde, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Beth, and thanks for everyone coming. I saw familiar friends here as well, so welcome, and thanks also for Jeff for the introduction, and congratulations to my fellow Arryman colleagues. Yeah, this is fantastic. I just received the news as well. So tonight, this morning or tonight in Indonesia, I'd like to share a chapter of my dissertation. It's gonna be Indonesia focused, but I'd like also to give all of you the context within which this chapter is embedded. So let me just share screen of my presentation. Yeah. I'm going to talk a little bit about the New Order's accommodation to religious politics during its, let's just say, second period, 1978 to 1983, during which the Minister of Religion is General Alamsyah Prawira Negara. Yeah. But let me talk a little bit about my dissertation project. Yeah. So I'm studying state policies and religion. Specifically, I'm interested in what we commonly refer to as religious law, in which religious norms and rules is legislated into positive laws. And this is an event in which the state is involved in what we call religion enforcement. This event also means that a successful religious politics is happening. By religious politics, I mean the politics of extending religious norms from the private sphere to the public sphere. So I'm interested in those specific phenomena: religious laws, religious enforcement, and a successful religious politics. So what was the puzzle? I mean, I would not be interested, for example, with a religious government in a religious countries passing religious laws. It's not surprising at all for me, but I would be really surprised if a constitutionally secular country is involved in the religion enforcement. There are three reasons for that. First, the government doesn't really have constitutional mandate to enforce religion. Constitutionally secular countries usually have non-religious ideologies, also other source of law besides the holy religious books. Also, it's not usually in the ideological interest of the secular elites at the helm of a government. And even if we argue regarding concessions to religious elites, this kind of concession entails really high costs. It might upset the broad secular and religious section of the society. Even the religious don't like to be forced to practice their religiosity, arguably. So there are also other types of concessions available for the secular government in this constitutionally secular state to religious elites and the religious population. That includes financial support. In the Indonesian case, Hajj are usually subsidized by the state. So I'm interested in those phenomena in which constitutionally secular government in the constitutionally secular state enforce religious norms and regulation. So let's look at the empirical cases. First, I would like to operationalize what I mean by constitutionally secular state. I built upon the work of some scholars, most notably Ahmed Kuru, who has these indicators of regimes, state religion regimes. When I'm talking about secular state, I'm talking about those countries in which religious institution doesn't really control legislature and judiciary, and there is no official religion. And how many countries are there? Well, apparently it's the dominant kind of state religion regimes. Most countries are constitutionally secular. And I would also like to see if those constitutionally secular countries have religious laws or involved in religion enforcement. I'm utilizing the religion and state data set by Jonathan Fox. So I built upon these scholars in the literature of religious legislation. I specifically pick up those types of religion policies in which the state enforce religious norms that govern individual behavior. My strategy is that I want to make sure that those kind of laws is religiously motivated. So I exclude, for example, financial support from the government to religious groups. And instead, I look at, for example, the presence of police force to enforce religious laws. I look at blasphemy laws and a restriction on interfaith marriages. These are the type of religious policies that I'm interested in. And so using those 30 types of religion policies as indicators, I can have some sort of index in which countries can be ranked from those scoring 0, which means they don't really have any religious laws. So they're not really involved in religion enforcement. And those countries in which they are having quite many religion enforcement kind of laws. Yeah, the maximum score is 30. So I would expect naturally most constitutionally secular countries not to score high numbers or very low or might be even 0 in this index that I tried to construct. And indeed, if we look at the distribution of scores of those index, the average scores of countries, constitutionally secular countries, there are like 106 of them globally, is only 2.4, which means they mostly score 2, and only a handful of them score way beyond the average. The median is 2, and most countries scored 2 as well. That's the mode. Maximum scores of those constitutionally secular countries is 16. And guess what? The country is Indonesia, the country that I'm working with. Yeah. So indeed, most secular countries pass very few religious laws. Yeah. Countries like France and Netherlands, for example, score 0 in the index that we are constructing. But there are also countries like Indonesia, Nigeria, and India that pass quite many religious laws and score way above global average. Like I just mentioned, Indonesia scored 16 in 2008. And these are example of countries, a handful of them from the region of Southeast Asia. We're not gonna be surprised if we see Brunei and Malaysia scored high because they are a religious state and they have established religion. But we might be surprised if we see Indonesia that scores quite highly. It's closer to the median Islamic Middle East, the double-digit score. And we see variation. Constitutionally secular countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Singapore, Burma, they have varying scores. So we're interested what factors drive this variation. And my dissertation is basically a theory building exercise looking at the case of Indonesia. Indonesia scored highs after democratization, wherein we see a proliferation of subnational Sharia bylaws. There's a handful of excellent studies have done on that, most notably Buehler and Motada, but also other scholars like Kikwe Hamayotsu and others that I cannot mention right now. But my finding, democratization is not the only driver of those state enforcement in religious, religious laws. Yeah, because during the New Order, we also saw this kind of religious laws or state involvement in enforcing religion. For example, the strengthening of the Islamic court, but most notably that we're going to talk a little bit in a moment is the Congress issued law, the TAP MPR of 1978, in which followed by a ministerial instruction, there is a distinction between proper religion recognized by the state and indigenous beliefs and non-orthodox kind of beliefs. Yeah, in Indonesian word aliran kepercayaan. So aliran kepercayaan or non-orthodox indigenous belief is not recognized as the state as a form of religion by the state, and this is a form of religion enforcement because those people following non-orthodox beliefs and indigenous beliefs would be forced to follow the 5 recognized religion by the state. And this is the case of Indonesia. It's interesting because it gives us an opportunity to exploit differences that the regime evolves over time in terms of its attitude regarding religion enforcement and the attitude toward the demand of religious politics from below. Initially, the New Order was suppressing religious politics and was not involved at all in religion enforcement, but it gradually gave positive endorsement and involved in religion enforcement over time. In this presentation, I focus on the first change that we recognize in the attitude of the New Order. That was in 1978, wherein President Suharto appointed Alamsyah Prawira Negara, a general, as the Minister of Religion, and then under Alamsyah Prawira Negara, a lot of accommodation to religious politics took place. Like I just mentioned, the instruction of the Minister of Religion number 4 in the year of 1978, depriving indigenous belief, Javanese mysticism from the proper recognition as a religion. This is a contrast pattern in terms of state policies and religion from the previous period in which the New Order regime suppressed religious politics. It rejected the proposal of the Islamists to amend Indonesian constitution. It rejected the proposal of the Islamists to prevent, for example, funds from abroad to their Christian counterparts, and so on. So the accommodation to religious politics in 1978 to 1983 is interesting because given other factors that stays constant, for example, the regime type, the New Order has not changed, has not crumbled. So at the top was still the military elites, and also the demography also not changing. Also the strength of the Islamist elites and the religious movement arguably was also constant. The indicators was the general election outcome in which Islamist parties was not victorious. So we can rule that out in some sort of controlled comparison design, and it opens opportunity for us to identify other factors that might drive the changes in the pattern of state religion policies of the New Order. And here's the comparison of religion policies during those periods. It's strikingly different under Alam Syah Prawira Negara. We have a proliferation of religion policies that far outnumber other minister of religion combined during the new order in the 32 years of its tenure. 23 of state policies on religion and focus mostly on that kind of discrimination to aliran kepercayaan, but also support to the Islamic groups. There was a religion policies on supporting dakwah. Dakwah is no longer, you don't have to apply for permit to do dakwah anymore, especially in the radio and in the mosque under Alam Syah Prawira Negara as the Minister of Religion, and so on. So this is the context of the period that I'm interested in, and the argument that I'm trying to build. So here it is, the key policies, the discrimination toward aliran kepercayaan, based on the TAP MPR or the Congressional Law number 4, 1978. It's basically disciplining the unorthodox believers and force them to adhere to the orthodox teaching of the 5 religions recognized by the state. That's the religion enforcement side of things. So I draw from other literatures, most notably from the power resource scholars and also scholars on authoritarian regime and its durability. My advisor himself, Jeff, is also a power resource scholar, but also other working on Southeast Asia like Dan Slater. The work on those literature helped me a lot in understanding the pattern of religious policies. The argument that I borrow from those scholars is that an authoritarian regime needs to construct what we would like to call a power coalition. They need to establish and assemble power resources in order to stay in power, in order to defend their tenure. It could be symbolic power resource, it could be a material power resource, and also the coercive power resource. And I would argue in this chapter that the positive endorsement and accommodation to the Islamist elite is partly caused by the breaking down of the power coalition of the new order, specifically the symbolic power resources that the new order received from the students and key nationalist figures suddenly withdrew their support to the regime. So the regime found themselves in a situation in which the, let's say, communal elites supporting the regime withdrew their support and actively criticized the regime. And they could not afford also to have no symbolic power resource at their disposal. That's the reason why they reached out to the Islamists. They could not afford if the Islamists also take an oppositional stand. In a famous argument by Slater, the positioning of the communal elites helped predict a successful democratic mobilization. If nationalists and religious elites take the oppositional stand to the regime, chances are we might gonna see a crumbling down of an authoritarian regime. So that's the focus of the argument that I'm building. The new order give concession to the Islamists and support religious politics because the students and key nationalist elites like General Nasution withdrew support to the regime in the mid-1970s until the late 1977. And then in the words of, in the analysis of Benedict Anderson, the new order was predicted to have its last days. You know, it was that severe, the situation for the regime. And wooing the Islamist elites with key accommodation to religious politics is part of the regime's effort to tilt the balance of symbolic power. In a figure, I'd like to schematize the argument that way. So you need coercive and symbolic power at once to have a legitimate government, to have and also to be able to employ, in case you needed your coercive power, you need some sort of support from the communal elites to legitimize your action. And if you lose it, you need to find a new symbolic power resource. So the students had always been supportive of the new order in the very beginning, until they found out that Suharto was also part of the problem. So there had been cases of corruption and irregularities that the student found, especially in their publication Mahasiswa Indonesia, in the early 1970s. The case of Taman Mini, the Bulog case. In 75, they have Pertamina. But in its early days, the students still believe in the what do you call that, sincerity of Suharto. You know, Suharto in the New Order has these lofty ideals, and only the people around President Suharto who were the crooks. You know, until very late that information circulated, found out that part of the first family also involved in irregularities and activities to enrich themselves. My evidence, I compare student support to the regime and Suharto from early 1970s to the late 1970s based on their writings and editorial in the Mahasiswa Indonesia Weekly. This publication is really representative of the voice of student activists back then. I managed to interview Rahman Toleng himself before he passed away, talk a little bit about Mahasiswa Indonesia. And the students as a group was quite forced to reckon in Indonesian politics back then. So their support was really meaningful and badly needed by the regime. And when the regime lost the support in late 1977, it was quite an event. The military-occupied campus, most notably Bandung Institute of Technology in 1977, the student committee all over Indonesia was frozen by the Kopkamtib. So that's the result of this newly emerged conflict between the students and Suharto. Yeah. So if we look at early students writing about Suharto, there always coverage of corruption, but at the same time, surprisingly, there's also positive news about President Suharto. So the students like the regime shows indication of being corrupt, but the president is good. So they did not completely withdraw their support from the regime as yet. Yeah. But late in 1977 and 78, the student was at the forefront to replace Suharto as president. They proposed alternative names, including the late Jakarta governor Ali Sadikin. Yeah, notable student activists, including Lukman Hakim, and then some Bandung student. They also write buku putih, yeah, to tell their position regarding the recent political development. That's the first withdrawal of symbolic power resource. But also the most severe to the new order is the position of General Nasution. General Nasution is a revolutionary hero. He's also widely regarded as the father of the army, especially for his contribution to the guerrilla warfare. Yeah. Every single figure in the army respected him, including Suharto, who used to be his subordinates in the 1950s. Yeah. So General Nasution began to criticize New Order widely in the newspapers in the mid-1970s. He also wrote excessive letters to the members of the MPR, asking them to reconsider their support to the regime. But most tellingly, Nasution decided not to vote in the general election of 1977. And he openly talked about how the regime has walked away from its constitutional commitment. For example, the secret of Suharto durability is he refused to be held accountable to the previous MPR members. So he needs to replace all the MPR members, pack them with loyalists first, before he present his laporan pertanggungjawaban. That's one of the key tricks of the longevity and durability of the new order. And it was a severe conflict in public in the mid 1970s. Yeah, the discussion why the president need to be reporting to the newly elected MPR, even though the law clearly says that he had to report to the previous MPR. So Nasution emerged as a fierce critique to the regime, and most problematic and troublesome to Suharto is that Nasution drew a lot of Islamic masses as his following. So the regime was kind of threatened with the position of Nasution. And an interesting part is when Yusuf Wanandi in his autobiography mentioned that Nasution was not always as, let's just say, as positive and meek to the regime as the history might note it, because he was actually very oppositional, staunch opposition if we look back to the archive. So that's the core of my argument. This is General Nasution, a very moralist general, anti-corruption. And in the 1950s, he was actually the one who summoned Suharto back to Seskoad, demoted him from the position of the commander of Central Java because of alleged irregularities that Suharto conducted back in Central Java. So he was some sort of anti-corruption figures within the army. And when he withdrew support from the regime basically lost a lot of his symbolic power resource. And that's when the regime began to think about reaching out to the Islamists. After Sidang Umum MPR, the Congress meeting, Suharto personally summoned Alamsyah Prawira Negara to Binagraha, then appointed him as the Minister of Religion with one special mission: to amend the worsening relationship between the regime and the Islamist elites, but also the Islamic masses. And that's the reason why Alamsyah was so determined to create all of those policy concessions. So better to have Islamist elites as friends than adversary during those crises in the late 1970s. That's the empirical story of my chapter that I'm sharing this morning. I think that's all. Maybe Mas Tesyono, as my respondent, would love to give me feedback. Thanks so much for listening. How am I doing on time, Beth? I hopefully I didn't take so much of the time, because we do have other three fascinating presenters after this.
Thank you, Gde. You're great on time. We're all giving you a round of applause for your presentation. Thank you. And yes, Testriono, the floor is yours if you'd like to share your thoughts.
Yep. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Gde. Thank you also, Pak Jeffrey. Good morning for the friend in Chicago and around, and also good after evening for those in Indonesia. First of all, I'm so honored to be here, to be among great, young, excellent scholars, Arryman scholars. If in the past we had what's so-called a Berkeley mafia in Indonesia's economic policy, so I'm imagining in the future we're gonna have what's so-called Northwestern mafia in social policy or social science. Also, congratulations, Gde, for passing the dissertation defense and then having one of the chapter ready to be published. Here, I'm not commenting for all the whole dissertation, because Gde just share me the one chapter of the dissertation. So my comment is just based on the chapter Gde shared to me. And yeah, the topic that Gde discussed is something that maybe already covered by historian, also political scientists, and it will much research by the social scientists. And also this is the period that is crucial in the formation of the new order regime. But I think they can bring up some new stories and some novel analysis here for us. And I think that is his contribution that make his dissertation or his paper is different from previous studies. In general, I read the paper is well written and provide a good and detailed narrative. Congratulations again for that today.
Thanks, Master Sri. Thanks so much.
Here I just want to give some reflection. What after I read your chapter, you discuss about the how changing power configuration within the new order regime can affect or shift the new order state policy on the on religion, and this is in the period of 1978 until 1983. You focus on the how the new order regime loss of symbolic power because students and also some intellectuals leave the coalition, the regime coalition, and it is proof that evidence that the new order regime no longer solid, and also there was a rivalry between generals, as happened in the Malari affairs, and because of that, Suharto's need for support from Islamists. If we read longer, we can find before this period, Suharto already tried to stabilize his regime. For example, there is a mono-loyalty to the government in 1970s. Also, there is a forced merger or fusion of political parties in 1973s, and also there is a floating mass policy where the political parties could not have political activities under the below the sub-district, below the sub-district level. Right. That's in 1973, right? Also, there is a political centralism law in 1974, and also we not forget about the marriage bill in 1974. So there are some policy already been done and been applied by Suharto. So I'm thinking, is that the shift of the state policy is really a shift, or there's a continuation from the centralization effort by the Suharto government? Whether is this that Suharto tried to put everything under his control because of the Malari, or because of it is a just continuation? The shift is it really a shift, or it is a continuation? So this is what I'm exactly thinking when I read your paper. And then also the policy of depriving aliran kepercayaan, I'm thinking, is it an accommodation of the Islamist group, or is it the response, as other scholars wrote already about that communists, many people believe that communists are hiding behind the aliran kepercayaan groups, and Suharto tried to put them also under control, because if not, so they think maybe the regime think maybe the communists still being a threat for the regime. Or also is that something else? As I mentioned before, because it is the period of regime creation, so it is part of the Suharto's effort to centralize power, including religion. So religion is something that, yeah, he tried hard to put it under his control. So that's what I'm thinking when I read your paper. And you also mentioned about Islamists. I think there is a need to put a little bit discussion on the concept. What do you mean by Islamists here? Is it, yeah, some scholars discuss or put the term to discuss a group of Islamic student Tarbiyah movement during 1980s and 1990s. But there are other scholars also who discuss who use the Islamists to name some Islamic groups or Islamic leaders who have whose interest to put back 7 words of Piagam Jakarta to UUD 45. So this is something that need to be clear. And and if you mean before 1980, so the Islamists can be some leader of NU or some leader of Muhammadiyah who have the interest to put the 7 words of Piagam Jakarta to Undang-Undang Dasar 45 in 1950s. Yeah, I think that's the point about the Islamists that you need to discuss, maybe a little bit about the use of the concept. And finally, you discuss a lot about Nasution, and you think that Nasution was a serious threat to the regime because he's charismatic or also influence in both in the military, also in the Muslim community. I'm just thinking, could a retired general with no political party be such a threatening to the regime, or maybe you can put some discussion about maybe any other general, a green general, Islamic general within Indonesian army that can be considered also a serious threat to the regime. So because the paper that I read is that you put Nasution is a big threat to the government, which I don't know, maybe I'm thinking that, is it Nasution so such a big threat to the regime, or because of you put it so salient in the paper? So if you can put maybe the discussion about any other green or Islamic general within Indonesian army to the paper, so so that's the regime very threatened for the presence of the Islamic general. So this will be more interesting or more make sense. And yeah, and finally, I think the discussion on the from the paper on the Suharto group or Suharto camp. You mentioned several times about Suharto group, Suharto camp, but I didn't find what are their voices. So there is little discussion on that part. So I didn't know the dynamics of the internal dynamic within the Suharto circle or Suharto group. How and why they change policy to, you said about a more accommodative towards the Islamic Islamist group. So yeah, that what I didn't find. So I think there were internal dynamic within the regime that you can find and you can provide here. So we can know that the shift of policy is was really happening during that time. So that's what I got from reading your paper. So yeah, I think if you can put this discussion to your paper, so it will be more interesting and more yeah yeah more clear to the reader.
Thanks so much, Mas
Yeah,
Desri.
that's all. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's fantastic. All valuable comments. I have take notes, and I will try to incorporate all of the comments in the paper pretty soon. How are we regarding?
We're good, Gde.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is a time where people who would like to ask Gde questions, please raise your hand. I know we already see some hands raised, and then you could also write a
There is Mas
question
Boni
in the chat.
raising hand. That Mas Boni, it's been a while, yeah. We met each other in 2012, if you remember us.
Yeah, I remember that.
Good to see you. How you doing?
Thank you. Okay. Can I talk now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good morning, good evening, Mas Jeffrey, Ibu Beth, and all the audience in this forum. It's an honor to be invited to this group. Yeah. Let me introduce myself. My name is Boni Hargens, and honestly, I could have been one of the first generation of Arryman scholars. I got a scholarship in 2012. Yeah, and I'm so sorry that I couldn't come to the States in the time because of some technical reasons, and I was still living in Germany in that time. Okay, well, Mas Gde, I did pay attention, very serious attention to your presentation, and I come to a conclusion that it's a very excellent research inquiry.
Thanks so much, Mas Boni.
That's why I need to put some comments. One thing I remember when we are discussing about the power tradition under Suharto regime, we remember how the conflictual tension between state and society was very severe in that time. And as you see, this has been a legacy of Suharto to the contemporary politics of Indonesia. And you see that the rise of the identity politics, the dominant influence of the religious elite in the political realm today has been a new mainstream. So my question is, how far do you see the obvious implication of the state-society relationship in the past to the new democracy model in contemporary Indonesia? Because what I see now, the rise of the right-wing populism has been the mainstream political movement in Indonesia.
Right.
And now we are discussing about any possibility to create a new model of democracy. Maybe we can find in next 5 or 10 years, Indonesia has no longer a secular democracy, but a religious democracy or theocracy or whatever the term we can name it. So I need your imagination. I mean, your scholarly imagination about the future of Indonesia as the impact of the rise of this identity politics, as the impact of the conflictual relationship between state and society in the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mas Boni.
Gde, could I suggest that you take 2 or 3 questions, collect a few, and then address the topics?
Sure.
Okay.
Maybe I'd better address some of the questions now, yeah.
Okay.
First from Mas Testri, he has a lot of recommendations and suggestions, so I'll just pick what I have on top of my mind right now. First thing about the aliran kepercayaan, was that really accommodation or not? or was it just a policy to suppress the continuing communist presence in the cloak of aliran kepercayaan? Yeah. I highly doubt it for two reasons. First, there was indeed a formal request by Hamka to Adam Malik, the ketua, I forgot, ketua DPR back that time, about don't let aliran kepercayaan to have a formal recognition. So it's formal request from the Islamist elites, so it's a formal demand. But also, in a normal situation, Suharto would not grant that. Suharto was widely known as a supporter of Javanese beliefs. He himself was a student of Romo Sudiat with Sujono Humardani. So his spiritual teacher is from Klaten, a Javanese mystic. Suharto was not known to be pious not until early 1990s, when a lot of scholars recognize Suharto start saying Islamic Assalamualaikum in every meeting and his speech. But before that, he was not known to be pious. So he was a supporter of Javanese mysticism, and he was quite neutral, not suppressing any one of them. In fact, if we look back to Clifford Gates' notes, aliran kepercayaan back then was quite victorious. Pangestu, Subud, they can do some, they can hold some congress, and it's totally getting support from the government. So the sudden suppression was surprising, and it's not about PKI at all, because everybody knows, and it's widely reported by the Tapol newsletter, that all of the remaining suspect of the communists has been in Buru. The Blitar, let's say, revolt has been repressed, if I'm not mistaken, in the early 70s. So I highly doubt this is about suppressing the PKI. About Nasution, I'm not the one who reported the severe conflict, but David Jenkins did. If you look at his notes in Suharto and his generals, the story was dramatic. There was an accusation that several colonels leading several battalions was behind Nasution, and Suharto talked to some of his aides in the army to neutralize those colonels. So there was some demotion and mutation within the army just to satisfy Suharto's curiosity and allegation about some battalions behind Nasution. It was widely reported in the newspaper back then, in Kompas especially, a rumor about Nasution being detained. If he was not that threatening, there was no reason to have this kind of rumors and talk. That's my quick comments on that. On Mas Boni, I think this is great. My advisor, Jeff, also been urging me to talk about how is your discussion travel to Indonesia today? How would you see Indonesia today? And I'm still working on a chapter just to discuss the state-society relation. My quick response to your really asked you the question, Mas Boni, is that even under democratic regime, any government would need symbolic power resource. It would need legitimacy. And in our current Jokowi's administration, the government always plays itself as a supporter of tolerance, supporter of a anti-extremist radical, anti-radical Indonesia. So that's part of the narrative, and that's the reason why the government also ally itself to certain groups in society, most notably the Nahdlatul Ulama, for example. So I think the legacy of the state-society relation of the new order to the democratic era is exactly those quests to find resources for symbolic power, those elites, religious and nationalists to support you. And I think the democratic era has witnessed its fair share of this struggle, one of the reasons why Jokowi picked certain figures as his running mate, for example, also based on that consideration, I believe. I think that's my quick response. And It's been an excellent question. Yeah, thank you so much. How are we on time, Beth? I don't want to take.
Yeah, we got about 10 more minutes. So
Time,
looks like there's about 3 hands raised there if you want to call on somebody.
I have Kikwe here. I'm really honored that Kikwe is coming to see my presentation. Would we be so kind to let Kikwe have the chance to ask questions, Beth?
Sure.
Kikwe, please.
I'm sorry,
I'm really honored that you're here. Yeah.
That is the last thing I wanted to. Good morning, everyone. So I have many questions, but I would like to read it first. But here I am talking as an Indonesia person rather than social scientist. So my comment are very much about Indonesia, empirical and a period. So I think this is exciting to see this particular period, because I think conventional wisdom in Indonesian political religion is that an accommodation start a little later, right? So establishment of Ichimi and so on. So Hefner and discussed about that. So I think in that regard, it is interesting to see. But my question is this period seems to be very noisy, right? So all those contestation, and I have been reading a lot about Hamuka, right? So Hamuka was getting close to Nasution, and he was appointed as the head of MUI, the founding chief of MUI 1976, if I'm not mistaken, right? So you can find a lot of noises, kind of a contestation between so-called secularist or nationalist on the one hand, and Islamist on the other. So I think I want to see the justification for looking at this particular period in a broader historical context, because this is historical analysis of religious politics, right? So the reason I'm asking this is because after this period, I think this Panchasila consolidation of Panchasila as a state doctrine emerged, right? If I'm not mistaken, it came, I think, 1980s, right? In 1986, the government enforced this Panchasila policy as a solo doctrine, and the enforcement was strengthened in a way to basically pacify and co-opt and weaken Islamists. So I think that can be interesting response, kind of important response to this Islamist discourse, which has been often dismissed in the Indonesian political cycle. So, and also this idea and concept of accommodation, I want to hear a little bit more. I see as a more as a co-optation of the Islamism. So this is the discussion about authoritarianism, right? It's not just about secular state, but it's powerful, violent military regime, and the military regime can various approach, and then one, you just kill them, right? So there was discussion among so-called nationalist, secularist circle, particularly among legal scholars who dominated the Supreme Court. We want to abolish Sharia court. So that was pretty dominant throughout after independence. And Islamists have to fight back. It's because killing Sharia court is basically make ulama and the religious elite basically unemployed, right? It's basically elimination of religious department. So I think that was very much a heated debate in 1960, 1970. So Islamists is fighting back. And also NU was very fighting back, right? During that time, NU ulama were considered as a neo-Darul Islam. It's like surprising, unimaginable perception of NU from 2020 right now. So I think you can give us some sense why this particular period, right? And secularist nationalism responds to it, particularly because the religious minister, what his name, the Prawara Nunara, right? He became a very strong opponent to the government, the regime in the 1980s, particularly when the government tried to implement so-called religious pluralism to weaken Islamism. So I think that you can give more nuance in a sense that the kind of a contestation politics over symbolic politics, right? So it's not just linear and continuation from the past, but in a way you see the interesting dynamic politics between those two forces, and you can kind of make an argument that why secular policy has been implemented in a way it has, because I think ultimately compared to other countries, I think the secular, I still keep insisting that secularism has got very strengthened because it is about cooptation rather than accommodation. So I think you can clarify a bit of concept in a comparative terms to give more nuanced account of Indonesian politics. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for these excellent comments. I just gave it a thought as well, Kikwe, with the cooptation term. There is this new article by Anne Slotker in Politics and Religion, the new article, and it really gave me some time to rethought. I think cooptation is a better term for these sets of policies, but it also works with my argument, because basically the regime wants to make friends with the Islamists, so they don't want to alienate the Islamists anymore, as they did in the first part of the new order. I will definitely come back to you in a private email. I really want to have you reading my paper later. So thanks so much for the excellent comments, and do keep in touch. We do have Rido and Mas Munjid.
Yeah, could I ask Rido and Pak Munjid to please ask your questions. Please be brief, and then we'll just give Gde a final quick word to wrap up, and then we'll move on to our research roundtable. Please, both of you, very briefly. Thank you.
Pak Munjid first or me?
Go ahead, Rido.
Okay. Gde, congratulations for your dissertation. This is really exciting.
Thank you, Bung Rido. Long time no see, ya. Sehat,
yeah, long time no see. Yeah, alhamdulillah sehat. But I'm just curious, and it's quite interesting with what Kikwe asked about the position the Islamists prior of 1978. How, like, it's not only the case of Hamka with the MUI in 1975 when the government decide to, let's say, gather all the Islamic force. We like NU, Muhammadiyah, even DDII under the umbrella of MUI. But also, you can say in 1967, the government started to accommodate the so-called Islamic dissident that coming from the Masyumi by allowing organization like DDII to be established by Nasir. So I'm just curious how your analytical framework can explain this kind of things that occur prior of 78, which I think kind of not contradict, but challenging your argument about the importance of
78, the period 78.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rido. Mas Munjid.
Pak Munjid, yeah.
Okay, thank you. My question actually is related to Kikwe's question earlier. I saw a gap here in your explanation. You know that in between 1978 and 1983, the new order was most powerful, I would say, or at least it laid the foundation, because in 1984, the Asas Tunggal Pancasila was established, right? So in between these years, actually, the new order was most powerful.
Yep.
And the Muslim thinkers like Cak Nur, Gus Dur, many others were trying to accommodate the new order, not the opposite.
Right.
It's the Muslim communities, it's the Muslim thinkers who try to accommodate because the order was so powerful.
Yeah.
And what's his name, Prawira Negara launched this 3 kerukunan program. Kerukunan between religious communities, kerukunan intra-religious communities, and kerukunan between the government and the religious communities. But the final purpose of that is to co-opt everybody. So what is your explanation here? Is it like the question by Kikwis? Is it really accommodating, or actually it's the foundation for further cooptation of these religious communities?
Thanks so much, Mas Mujid. This is excellent comments. Yeah, I'd say cooptation or accommodation doesn't really go against my argument, because it is both a change in terms of the overall patterns from the previous period in which the new order blatantly, outrightly suppressed religious politics and the religious elites. Yeah. And regarding 7883, you're right, it's getting stronger, but exactly because the new order get his things together. Like Alamsyah reached out to the Islamist communities and make amend, getting the relationship better. So I think Alamsyah was quite successful because of that. But also we have to remember that Benny Murdani was called back to Indonesia as assistant intel in early 80s, but also late 78. So the new order is like gathering symbolic power, but also strengthening the coercive power resources, having new personnel into its army family. So you're right, it's getting stronger, but the crisis is prior to 1978. The crisis is most notable and recognizable in 77 and 76. The Sawito affair, especially a plot to reveal Suharto's corruption. So I need to be clear about the periodization, but you're right, 78, 83, it's getting stronger. Rido's question, MUI was actually a form of putting, what do you call it? It's a cooptation, but there is a term for it. It's not accommodation. The regime actually wanted to control the Islamists and the religious masses, not giving them any concession. We know that because there was a conflict between Hamka and Alamsyah Prawira Negara. Hamka said something, and Alamsyah felt that he stepped out of his way, and Hamka actually was resigned. He resigned because of this conflict. So the regime still hold the upper hand, even though the MUI was established in 1975. So real accommodation actually start and cooptation actually start in 1978, not before that. I would argue that way. I think that's for my presentation. I thank every single respondent for the excellent comments, and I take a lot of notes here. How are we on time, Beth?
Thanks, Gde. Thank you so much for your presentation. And we're going to move on to the Research Roundtable. But yeah, thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting and informative. Thank you to Testriono for your response to Gde, and for everyone for your questions. So we have something new this year. We're calling a Research Roundtable. These are further along Arryman scholars, PhD candidates. They're going to be talking about their research experience, what they learned doing their field research, and how their ideas evolved. So first up, we're going to have Yoes Kenawas, and he is an Arryman scholar and PhD candidate in political science. He will speak, and then afterwards we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A for him. So Yoes, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Beth. Hello, everyone. Good evening to those of you who are in Jakarta and Southeast Asia, and good morning to you who live in Evanston and Chicago. It's glad to see you again in this annual Arryman Symposium, and thank you for EBGS and ISRSF for holding this year's Arryman Symposium. And it's always been a pleasure for me to attend this distinguished forum, both as an attendee and as a panelist. So today I'm going to talk a bit about my dissertation research and how the dynamics on the field influence my the ways in which I think about my research. I will focus on how the dynamics on the field after I did my field work influenced how I see my dissertation. And I'd be happy to talk about some of the problems that I faced when I was in the field. But I think for me, the situation on the field after I finish my field work has been really challenging for me. So the working title of my dissertation is Dynasty Incorporated, the Emergence and Endurance of Political Dynasty in Indonesia. So I investigate the variation of dynastic politics at the local level in Indonesia, at the provincial and the municipality and district level in Indonesia. And some of the questions that I try to answer in this research, including why do some areas are more prone to political dynasty than others, under what conditions political dynastic politics can emerge in democratic environment, who are the dynastic politicians, why do some families are better than others in building their political dynasties, or in other words, why do some families succeed while others have failed. And all of these questions will eventually help me to answer the ultimate question, that is, why does dynastic politics matter for democracy? Or if I can rephrase it, what are the implications of the presence of political dynasty in a democratic system? Why they can emerge in a system that was designed precisely to avoid monopoly of power based on one of them familial relationship. So based on these questions, and then divide my dissertation chapters into 6 chapters to address the what, where, when, who, how, and finally why questions. One of the most asked questions and the most challenging question for me when I started this project is, why do we need to discuss dynastic politics, and why Indonesia is a good place to study such a phenomenon? So therefore, one of the most challenging research tasks for me is to answer a simple yet tricky question, and that is, how dynastic is Indonesian politics? And I need to answer this question not only to justify why my research is important, but if I look from a broader point of view, this question matters for me to find some early patterns where dynasty could emerge, under what conditions dynasty would emerge, and if there's a place where dynasty failed to emerge, why would that be the case? So the first thing that I did before I left for my fieldwork was to build a data set of Indonesian political dynasty at the subnational levels. Based on this data set, I found that although the growth rate of political dynasty in the past 20 years was quite high, there were some areas that were relatively free from political dynasty, and mostly are located in major cities such as Jakarta, Surabaya, Makassar, and Medan. Remember, this is back in 2019. And some provinces also, like Kepulauan Riau, were also relatively free from political dynasty, at least when we look at the local executive branch of government. In some of those areas, there were failed attempts to build political dynasties. This includes Makassar and Kepulauan Riau, or Riau Islands, 2 areas that I visited during my fieldwork. I expected that in these areas, I could find an answer why politicians or aspiring dynasts failed to build political dynasties. I would especially focus on the structural factors in those areas because I also followed this excellent book chapter by Michael Buehler, saying that the higher the degree of economic autonomy or development correlates negatively with the occurrence of political dynasties in those areas. So I focus on the structural factors in those areas, including the local socio-economic situation, such as the economic composition, level of economic development, level of industrialization, level of education, and etc. I expected that in areas where the society is quite diverse, the economy is relatively modern and the level of education is well developed, attempts to build political dynasties are likely ended in failure. And based on my initial data set, this hypothesis seems legit because Makassar and Kepulauan Riau have the history of rejecting dynastic candidates in local elections. So I went there. I went to Makassar and Kepulauan Riau. In Makassar, in 2018, a pair of very powerful candidates who were backed by the Kalas family and the former mayor of Makassar failed to win the elections, even though there was only one pair of candidates in that election. So they lost from an empty ballot back then. The story from the field seemed to confirm my hypothesis. Most of my interviewees agreed that the people of Makassar was angry because of the arrogant display of power by the families who backed the losing candidates. They rejected political dynasty and opted for other candidates who failed to join the election. That's why the empty ballot won the election. This very unique case in Indonesia. And the mighty campaign team of the losing candidate was unable to sway the support of the people of Makassar and who come from various socioeconomic backgrounds. Similarly, in Kepulauan Riau, they also had history where dynastic candidates failed to win elections despite enormous support from the bureaucracy at the provincial level. So these two areas were perfect to answer why some subnational units never see the emergence of political dynasty in their local politics. But then the 2020 elections came. And in this election, dynastic politicians won in Makassar and in Kepulauan Riau. So this is after I finished my field work and my argument was quite solid back then. And then this happened. Dynastic politicians grabbed powers in major cities, including in Makassar, Batam, and also most notably in Medan, where the son-in-law of the president won the elections there. Of course, we can also include Surakarta or Solo, where the son of the president won the subnational elections. So in Makassar, the newly elected deputy mayor is the wife of former regent of Baru, one of the regencies in South Sulawesi. Her husband is now a member of the national parliament and also an influential figure of the Nasdem party. In Kepulauan Riau, the newly elected deputy governor is the wife of the existing mayor of Batam, one of the cities in Kepulauan Riau, who also won his re-election in the same year. So this development really gave me a headache, and I was confident that dynastic politics would be difficult to be exercised in cities and especially in areas with a high level of diversity. But I was wrong. I was wrong. I was totally wrong. And political dynasty could even still emerge in those areas. Dynasty could actually penetrate and win in areas that I thought would have a strong structural factors to prevent the emergence of political dynasty. And this new data made me nauseous. I was so galau. Galau means, like in limbo and couldn't eat and sleep. But no, I'm just kidding. But it gave me some stress. So I tried to look at the bigger picture. I found that this new development seems consistent to my initial gut, that no matter what the structural factors looks like, dynastic politics as a mode of organizing power can always find a way to dominate local politics. This pattern is even clearer when we look at other major cities, as I mentioned before, like Medan, that also fell into the hand of Jokowi's son-in-law in 2020, or Semarang, another major city, where both the mayor and the deputy mayor are part of two different political families, or in South Tangerang, where three dynastic candidates represent three competing parties in the 2020 election. So whoever won, dynasty will won in in South Tangerang. Surabaya actually almost saw the rise of political dynasty, had the son of the mayor back then, Risma, won the party nomination, but he failed to win the party nomination. So among major cities in Indonesia, there are only two major cities that can be considered as dynastic free. First is First is Jakarta, and second is Surabaya. So this fact helped me to rethink about the nature of dynastic politics. Political dynasty could actually emerge almost everywhere. Areas that were previously dynastic free do not mean that they will remain free from political dynasty in the future. And the existing institutional arrangements, poor party institutionalization, symbiotic relationship between dynastic politicians and political parties, and most importantly, how individuals in the family can work together as a political organization, mean that political dynasty could emerge be it in rural areas or even in major cities where the society is relatively diverse and economically autonomous. The fact that Jakarta and Surabaya are still free from political dynasty should be treated as an anomaly rather than the norm. Still, I think that there is a possibility, even the possibility is quite small right now, but dynastic politicians could one day emerge in these two cities. So to wrap up, initially I planned to discuss the spread of dynastic politics in my Where chapter, and in this chapter I wanted to say something like diversity, development, modernization could prevent political dynasty to emerge in democracy. Something that would support, quote unquote, the modernization thesis. And because my initial data said so, the theory also said so, I want, and my initial findings from the field also suggest that this could be the case. However, based on the latest development from the field, I should think about it more carefully and really focus on the organizational aspect of dynastic politics, which has been the focus of my research. I will also need to rethink about nature of dynastic politics, and I think this twist of plan has forced me to redefine what dynastic politics is, and I think it will be a contribution to the development of the literature. Thank you everyone for listening. And oh, I forgot to answer the question, how dynastic is Indonesian politics? It's very dynastic. It's becoming a new normal in Indonesian politics, and I think the space for non-dynastic politicians to compete in local elections will be smaller and smaller in the future. And I think those who haven't built political dynasty, they will eventually think to build political dynasties in the future. Those who are not part of political dynasty right now, when they won elections, they won the second re-elections, and I think most of them will naturally think, who's going to support who's going to continue my legacy. And in the situation where political party ideology is very weak and everything, I think dynasty could be an option for them to extend their power. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Yoes. Looks like you have some hands raised there.
Yep.
Jeffrey, you have a question?
Hi, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll be just very brief. And of course, Yoes can take several questions and then pick which ones he wants to answer. It's always up to the to pick and choose. First of all, I thought it was really useful for everyone to hear that story of how you go into the field with a paradigm, a model, and then the field work and the realities on the ground challenge your model, and you have to be very adept at reformulating. And the crisis one experiences is very common. Oh my God, nausea, everything else. So welcome to the world of learning. And so I would say, exciting that happened, and don't worry about it. But the substantive question I want to ask is, as Indonesia becomes more dynastic, would you say that it becomes less democratic? In other words, you mentioned the term dynasties as being a form of political organization, right? And there are many forms of political organization. Is there something special about dynasties which you think are in conflict fundamentally with democracy? And that's all I'd like to ask. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Sindhu, perhaps? I see Sindhu raising.
Oh yeah, hi Yos. So thank you for sharing your work. I remember like the last time we had coffee in Jakarta pre-pandemic, you were pretty anxious about not being able to build sufficient rapport with your interlocutors, which is a very valid anxiety, I must say, given that talking about political dynasty with actors who are actually doing it must be some delicate and sensitive matters, right? So I'm pretty curious about the way you fared on the field given this challenge. In other words, like how did you develop a rapport with your interlocutors that enabled you to gather some valid and insightful information on Indonesian political dynasty? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Sindhu. So thank you both Jeff and Sindhu for your excellent questions. So to answer Jeff's question, this is the most difficult part of, because so I think Indonesia become less democratic with this emergence of dynastic polarization. Yes, the competitions are still there in some areas. Non-dynastic politicians could beat political dynasties, but in many other areas, I'm seeing more and more centralization of power in the hands of some families. Even in areas like Banten, it looks like a cartel of political dynasties. It's like musical chair among them. So today, I'm a member of family from family A become the governor, and the deputy from family B, and next time family B become the governor and the deputies from family A. So it's getting less democratic. I think Indonesia has become in that sense, and many people have actually highlighted the freedom part, the liberty part of Indonesian decline, authoritarian decline, right, or democratic decline in the past couple of years. But I would argue also, we also have to take a look into the electoral part of democracy, and I think it's getting more less. It's getting less democratic in the past couple of years, and I think the trend will continue at least in the near future, as long as there's no changes in that sense. Because I mean, in the ideal settings, political party should be the forces, the organization where people's voice will be ditampung, they will be aggregated, and then they will fight for policy in the parliament and or in executive level. But right now, what we're seeing is only, as you mentioned in your book, oligarchy at the subnational level become more and more apparent, and then they're not representing the interest of the broader people, but they're representing a very small group of elites, be it in economic or in politics or even in bureaucracy. So it's all interlinkage, and I think it's become less and less democratic if we are seeing it from electoral point of view. So that's my answer to your question, Jeff. And for Sindhu, thank you for the question. And yeah, it's quite difficult to build a rapport with my interlocutor, especially with the member of political dynasties, because they're very suspicious, and because Indonesian media portrays political dynasties in a very negative sense. So it's very difficult for me to approach them, to talk to them, even to get access to interview them. In some cases, when I have the access to interview members of political dynasties, they're mostly talk in a very normative sense. like, oh, I'm not building political dynasty because I'm still elected. So even if you read all this, the same narrative that they always repeat in the media, and it's quite difficult to actually ask them how they operate and everything, because they're very sensitive to that question. So how do I develop? There are several ways to build a rapport with my interlocutor. First, I mean, if you meet them repeatedly, eventually they will open up to you and speak of their truly mind. But I didn't have so many cases where I can interact with them in a very long time repeatedly. But there's some cases where I can do it. For example, when I was in South Sulawesi, I joined their this what they call, like touring, like motor touring. I joined one of the accompanying car, and during that trip, I repeatedly talk with them and try to understand how they build their power, how they cooperate as an organization, and how they actually link with the broader economic network or business network in South Sulawesi. And only by observing those kind of in those kind of settings, I can see that, oh, this is how they build their power. This is how they actually view who should continue their legacy and everything. Because sometimes this kind of insight came up during the lunchtime, and sometimes that's the only way how to approach them. Other than that, I usually focus not on the dynastic politicians, but people around the dynastic politicians. I focus on their success team, and more importantly, I also focus on those who get beaten by, or those who lost the electoral race from dynastic politicians. Then I know how they deal with the system, how they build their organizational power, something. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Yoes.
No problem.
I think we're gonna have to wrap up the Q&A at this point and move on to our next scholar. But thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, everyone.
So our next Arryman scholar that's going to be giving a talk on the research is Sabina Puspita. She is a PhD candidate in political science. So yes, Sabina, if you can just start off and let us know the working title of your dissertation and your research experience.
Thank you very much, Beth, and thank you very much, everyone, for your time, and thank you for the opportunity for me to discuss a bit about the two things that you mentioned just now. So first of all, my working title would be The Politics of Gender Equality in Indonesia from 1945 to the present. How has that been going as I'm working on the field? A lot. I have probably shifted many times from my original prospectus. However, I am more than happy to receive your feedback, and I'm actually hoping very much from this forum, everyone present here, to help me further map gender equality in Indonesia. So the reason why for this session, I am naming it Mapping Gender Equality is precisely because I don't have the map yet. And hopefully that map is going to be called The Politics of Gender Equality in Indonesia from 1945 until the present. So if you have noticed how Dr. Metera and Yoes Kenawas are talking about religious politics in Indonesia, and then dynastic politics. So I'm kind of starting off in a very similar direction. That is, well, first I started off with the question of why, despite democratization, why do we see an increase of disempowering policies for women? That question has shifted, obviously, because of fieldwork. And now I am more interested in looking at what explains the improvement of and the impediment to gender equality. I think what Dr. Metera and Yoes Kenawas have very well presented to us, my core assumption is those things would affect women very much in the context of Indonesia. And so I would like to see how democratization affect struggles for gender equality, particularly women's struggles for gender equality. Now, if I started off from seeing how Indonesia fared in this world. The World Economic Forum Gender Gap Report shows that Indonesia is doing not bad relative to Nigeria and India, which Dr. Metera also sort of show in terms of religious politics. But also in terms of the gender gap, Indonesia is doing not bad. But as my advisor, Professor Jeffrey Winters, have always reminded me that there is a difference between absolute levels and the capacity to change. So we're probably talking about absolute levels when we see how Indonesia is doing in terms of giving women access to education, access to political offices, access to facilities of survival and maternal health, and access to economic opportunities. But I think every country has the capacity to change, and it probably depends on the scale of the population, the economic development, degree of income inequality, and the form of polity. And this is where I enter the form of polity. In scholarship about democratization, probably in the classics like Dahl or Juan Lins or Rushmeyer, Stephans, they talked a lot about how with political liberalization within the process of democratization, it's going to spur or at least tackle a lot of issues of inequalities, race, including gender. And so starting off from there, I narrow it down again to see what the scholarship says about gender equality. Three scholarship in particular that I would like my work to converse with. The first is the state feminism scholarship. The state feminism scholarship does a lot of research on how women's movements have been included by the state to start spurring feminist policies within the state structure. And also, when they're outside the state, how did they build partnerships with government elites to produce better policies for women? Now, the problem with the state feminism scholarship is they are highly focused on post-industrialist countries. And I don't seem to see where Indonesia would fit within that framework. The second scholarship is the social movement scholarship, clearly. How women's movements use their resources, how they make good use of open political opportunity structures. If we see like democratic transitions, that's when we know there's a political opportunity opening and it's time for people to start mobilizing. Things like that. Now, the social movement scholarship hasn't really built a theorization of the Indonesian women's movement. There are a lot of works about Latin America women's movements. For example, we know that the women's movement in Chile has a lot to do with how they mobilized for Allende, socialist president, and then later they mobilized for not against, for Pinochet. That is, which is a highly authoritarian military regime. But there are questions of how united are these women's movements? When we talk about women's movements, are we talking about feminist women? Are we talking about religious feminists or non-religious or secular feminist movement? Women's movement is not as united as we would think. And so I'm interested in mapping out the differentiations, the varieties of women's movement groups. Now, the third scholarship would be the comparative politics of gender scholarship. If you've ever heard of Wayland or Gabriela Bardell, they talk about, they would emphasize on the gender aspects of their of politics to talk about the degree of democratization of a country or the motives of state violence. And then if you've ever heard of Terry Caraway, she talked a lot about how gendered labor policies can actually help us talk about the sequence of industrialization in Indonesia. So I'm aiming for producing a work that shows how the Indonesian case is imperative, is important, and is significant for two things. The first thing is I want to show that the Indonesian case, Indonesian women's movement case in particular, will advance our theories on how democratically elected governments, how dynastic they could be or how religious they could be, but they are democratically elected, can affect women's struggles for gender equality. And then the second thing is that how movements can affect gendered political violence. Now, how would I narrow down my question for such an ambitious endeavor? I guess a second sub question was that I would be questioning what effects actually do women's movements have on policies related to women, related to women's relations with men, related to women's relations to the state. When I say state, I don't mean state of Illinois. When I say state, I mean country, governments, national governments. And so I hope that by this sub question, I'd be able to show my readers how do changes occur, and in terms of gender equality, how do changes occur and in which direction are we heading? Are we heading a direction in which there's a conservation of gender inequality? In this case, are we seeing conservative women's movement groups advancing their goals, advancing their practices, advancing the discourses in the society, discussions they want to spur, and the political threats that they want to build on to the state, or are we seeing a progression to gender inequalities? And what do these two things mean to our quest for gender equality? What does democratization play? Where the effects that we see from democratic transitions? So because of these aspects that I've just told you, my strategy is to divide 3 periods of my analysis. There are in talking to my informants, mostly women's movement activists or former women's rights politicians, they have a lot of ideas about how we should view the periodization of Indonesian history. This might quite differ from what they've explained to me, but I think, at least for now, I'm dividing it into three regimes. The old order from 1945 to 1965, and then the new order 1966 to 1998, and then the post-1998 period, with 1999 until the present. Now, within the post-1998 period, I call the years after 2001 as post-reformasi. I claim that reformasi ends in 2001, at least in the gender equality perspective, because we witnessed a vice president who is out in the public, living in practicing polygamy. In that sense, I mark it as the end of reformasi, because that means reformed failed in the gender equality perspective. And then also notice how in each regime transitions, there would always be an unprecedented level of sexual violence. In 1965, women are arrested, tortured, raped for their political activism. In 1998, women are no longer politically active. In fact, the least politically active group of women were raped systematically. And so, what does this mean to my project? I think my challenge is to, and this will be the last part of my discussion, my challenge is to process, trace how these movements and the strategies that they took to support or to stop a policy that is related to women. How do I measure the extent to which the change was a movement, success, or failure? It would be quite a bit of a challenge to make my argument, saying that when women's movement take certain different strategies, their work actually succeeds in changing policies A, B, C, D, E. Like, for instance, I went to the field in a time when Baik Nuril is a landmark case of this a woman who was a teacher, who was, I'm sorry, not a teacher, but she was an administrator in school. And she was sexually abused, verbally harassed by her employer, but instead she got arrested, jailed for defamation. And I came at a time when an amnesty by the president and the legislative government came out and forgave Baik Nuril. So those kind of things are helping me to think, could that be the work of women's movements outside the state or inside the state? Or maybe there's a link in between. And then now the hot debate about whether we should have a family resilience bill that would further regulate women's roles in the private sphere, or should we have a national bill on the anti-sexual harassment, the eradication of sexual harassment? Should we have that bill is now a really hot debate on where we want to direct our democratization. Where are we heading? Are we going to conserve gender equalities, or are we going to direct this country into a progression to gender equality? Those are the challenges. So process tracing is still what I'm facing in terms of challenges, but I think there are lots of opportunities ahead, especially in these times of COVID. Funnily enough, I could probably still continue data triangulation through direct interviews with my research subjects through online platforms such as Zoom and WhatsApp and all that, just to make a good, clear measurement of how do we actually advance gender equality, and does the women's movement succeed in those terms. I will stop here. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to receiving your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sabina. It looks like you have a question from Naima Talib. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask Sabina your question, please.
Hi, Sabina. Congratulations, fascinating study and presentation. I just would like to ask a little bit, do you see any different meaning makings of gender equality in each regime? And if you see any dominant women's movement, how they frame the meanings of gender equality, if you can see in each regime or across times. Thank you so much, Sabina.
Thank you, Naima. Do we collect?
Yeah, any other questions, or if no other questions, then you can answer her, but. Go ahead, Sabina, why don't you answer her question?
Okay, thank you, Beth. Thank you, Naima, for spending your precious time. I guess your child is gonna hate me because I think this is a time when you should be relaxing with your family. But thank you very much for your fantastic question. Yes, based on my current analysis to date, there are a big shift in the meanings of gender equality by different dominant movement groups in different regimes. I guess before I go into how it changes, there's a change from how I originally wanted to select my cases into not how I transform it now. So I originally wanted to study individual organizations, individual women organizations, the dominant ones in each regime. This Garwani, the Communist Party affiliated major women's group in the old order, and then the new order. This probably the Kowani, but Kowani and Garwani are not really apple to apple, and so I shift a bit. I won't be working on women's organizations anymore, but more on women's movement network. So it's a network of a lot of organizations that coalesce together for a gender equality frame that they want to push to policies. So in that sense, in the new old order regime, women were fighting for how women can be equally militant in the revolutionary struggle against imperialism, be it Western imperialism or the Japanese imperialism, because it was 1945. It was that period when we gotta be building this nation without foreign interventions, and women have an equal part in this revolutionary struggle. And then Saskia Wiringa, a very famous scholar, she wrote extensively about how Garwani, how progressive it could be, will end their coalition. And in that period, they were still emphasizing how women can do great in both spheres, in the public revolutionary struggle and in private domestic roles. Like they can be good mothers and also good fighters. And then in the new order, Kowani was the dominant women's movement network. And then I think in my reading, they think gender equality is when women can be equal contributors to their male counterparts to development, to national development. And it's still almost the same like what Garwani has set in motion, that is, women can be great in both areas. The private sphere, they could be great mothers. In the public sphere, they can be great spouses to their husbands who are contributing to development. And then after 1998, that's the biggest challenge. There are a multitude framings and meanings and changes of what gender equality actually means, also because democratization post 1998 diversified the kinds of women's movements. There isn't a dominant one in this in this most recent current regime yet, at least to date, based on my very still rough analysis. I hope that answers your question, Naima. Thank you very much.
Yes,
very much for that.
yes. Thank you, Sabina. Thank you. Excellent. Well done.
Thank you.
Sabina, Amrina has a question for you. She just messaged me. She'd like to ask.
Hello, Sabina. Thank you so much for sharing your research. It was amazing, and it was excellent to see how it develops. So I have a question for you. So like in the United States, there are some people who are called Afro-pessimists who think that racial inequality is inherent in American politics. So they believe that if the state passes a law that is pro-Black, it's because they only do that because the law only benefits white people. So they kind of like pass the law because it benefits them as well. So my question is, do you also observe like a similar pattern with gender empowering laws in Indonesia? In the sense that the state only passes gender empowering laws, not because they merely care about women, but also the laws also benefit men or other actors other than women. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amrina.
And then Dika, if you want to go, your question, please.
Thank you so much, Sabina, for sharing this fascinating work. And I've been a big fan of your work, and I'm really looking forward to read even more the final form of this research being published. I have a quick question. Since you mentioned that since 1998, there is this kind of like diversifying kind of women movement, and knowing that there is this increase in identity politics in Indonesia since then, I'm just wondering if the pattern you're seeing in the women movement per se in Indonesian context is toward the patterns of convergence or divergence. Because also we see that there are international movements that also bring influence to the Indonesian women movement scenes, like Women's March and everything. Do you think this kind of forces can contribute toward the convergent kind of pattern in the women movement, or it will remain the old stories of, because of the identity politics, certain aspects of women movements, they departed from others movement, and it's hard to find a way to converge and being united for bigger change. Thank you.
Thanks, Dika. Can we have Nika ask her question too, Sabina? Okay, go ahead, Nika.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Sabina, for the presentations. Congratulations for at least writing and finishing some of your chapters. My question is related to Dika as well, but more instead of convergence and divergence, I'm wondering, what do you see continuing from women's movement across the 3 periods that spans for more than 50 years? Because I believe that sometimes changes are pretty much seen or more easily to be captured, but I'm wondering about the continuity across the 50 years, more than 50 years of movement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Do I answer the question?
Go ahead, Sabina. You got about 5 minutes. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Very quick. Thank you very much for your very wonderful questions. Amrina, I think to cite a fellow colleague in policy, I just graduated, Isabella Castillo. I think she wrote about female suffrage in Latin America, and she talks about how yes, there are certainly strategic motivations in establishing these policies for women. Absolutely, the way you put it is very nice. Of course, in the case of Indonesia, it will definitely benefit some people as well. But the question is, how the women's movement, leverage that? Like, how do they actually make the argument and prove their point that if you, dear government, establish the policy that we want, it's going to be good for you as well. It's going to be good for the men as well, not just us. And that is a question of how they mobilize their resources, how they build coalitions, in the government, outside the government, and things like that. But that's a very good question that you make, and I've noted down. I hope to be able to address that question in my dissertation. Dika, thank you. I'm also a fan of your work. Patterns of divergence or convergence. I'm not able to answer fully, but I think there's a strong indication of patterns of convergence, like we're talking about. Probably, you know, it was a shock for everyone when Trump was elected, and then we get all this very frightening policies on abortion and women's health rights and all this stuff. And then in Brazil, we have Bolsonaro, when the women's movement are really demobilized, and then absurd policies as well on women and stuff like it. So there are strong indications of patterns of convergence in the democratization sense, but in terms of the diversity of women's movement sense, there's probably patterns of divergence, even more diverted groups, you know, defiant groups from the normal, from the usual kinds of women's movements that we usually see in previous regimes. Probably new ones could emerge in the new regime. I think that's my simple take for now, but I hope my dissertation will address your very good question. And Nika, thank you very much. I think it's a very good question. What's the continuity? The continuity would be the polygamy issue. Polygamy issue is always an issue about if it's, you know, if it's an indicator of our democracy not going forward, if women's rights are being attacked, if gender inequality are being conserved. Polygamy has always been an issue internally, externally, intergroups, you know, groups of the so-called leftist, well, not leftist, but you know what I mean, the Indo-Progress kind of groups, all that, and the feminists, and also maybe religious feminists, because the issue of polygamy is not a simple one. A lot of women don't have choices and had to live the polygamy life. Structural changes because of democratization sometimes can lead us to no choice but polygamy for survival. So I guess a very last answer to your question is, I hope my dissertation does not romanticize modernity or you know, women too much. I hope it's able to give a realistic empirical picture of what lies ahead in terms of gender equality in our country. Thank you very much, Nika. Sorry, I sound so nationalist, our country, but like Indonesia, period. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabina. Give you a round of applause. Up next is Arryman Scholar and PhD candidate in sociology, Wara Urwasi. The floor is yours, Wara.
Okay, thank you so much, Beth. So yeah, my name is Wara Urwasi, and for today I'm going to talk about my my dissertations. The working title is Ideas, Spatial Institution, and Local Politics Behind Varied and Uneven Urban Informality Governance in Jakarta, Indonesia. So just like previous presentations from Yoes and Sabina, so I want to talk about the phases of my dissertation process, the prospectus, the field, and the current project. And what I want to highlight is the transformations that I made from the prospectus to the current project in terms of research questions, framework, and some concepts. So my prospectus, or what I thought my project would be, is about global city formation and urban exclusion. And what I mean by global city formation is the process in which cities or city government attempt to increase their global economic competitiveness particularly by attracting or making their cities as centers for international business and attracting capital. So in this process, those cities with high populations of informal communities or that have a lot of informal settlements often shows the increase of forced evictions because of the needs to capitalize land and property or to use the land as to make the world-class infrastructure development. And of course, we can see that this exclusionary pattern is very common, including in Jakarta, which also align with most of the studies in urban political economy. But based on my early readings from the secondary sources, it seems that Surabaya, in comparison to Jakarta, has displayed a more inclusive mode of global city formations. So it's able to increase economic competitiveness while at the same time preserving most, if not all, of the informal settlements, especially the kampungs. And I think people are familiar with kampungs, but if not, so it's basically a densely populated settlements with a cluster of self-built housings. The land status is uneven, but most of them are most of the owners or the people that live in the kampungs don't really have a legal certificates ownership of the land. So for the prospectus, the question is, why then we see this variation in global city making in which some cities are more exclusionary toward informal settlements than other cities? And to develop the initial framework that later guide my initial field research is I engage with the literature in urban inequality. In particular, I'm looking at more of a from the colonial and historical legacy approach, institutions and the politics of the urban poor. So the hypothesis is that the presence of urban poor's activation in a city before the establishments of planning institutions made the inclusionary pattern of global city making more likely. So my task then worked first to show the presence or absence of urban poor's activation during colonial period, and then how the engagement of the urban poor's being institutionalized in the planning traditions, and then to show how the planning traditions able to filter the capitalistic forces and influence governmental response to informal settlements. So those are the plans, right? And then for the field, I chose to compare Jakarta as the case of a more exclusionary global city formations and Surabaya as the more inclusive one. And I plan to conduct field research in both cities. Also wanted to do the archival work in the Netherlands for a total of 14 months of field work. So I started my fieldwork in July 2019. And in the beginning, it was pretty difficult for me because I haven't really spent much time in Jakarta. So to navigate myself in the city, even that takes quite some time. And I also remember this one professor in anthropology asked me what kind of researchers I use. So I'm not sure how to answer that, but I think that the question's directed to whether you are more of an archival person or people person that, doing interviews and etc. And I was thinking that I'm much more comfortable first in more of the conducting archival work. So that's what I did first. And I started collecting documents from the government agencies at the ministerial and city levels, especially those related to national development plans, city plannings, and some programs related to land ownership, land use, and housing. I collected some archives from the National Archives and Jakarta Provincial Archives. But then I also conducted field observations and interview. And instead of, I'm not really comfortable of doing this first, I'm not an ethnographer, but actually part of that field work that later shifted my dissertation's direction was actually these observations and interviews. So I conducted observations in different informal settlements, mainly in North Jakarta and West Jakarta. The access was in the beginning was actually from the urban poor activists and informal community leaders. And I also participated in some of the informal community meetings, becoming volunteers in their events. And I also able to observe the interactions between the informal communities with the governor, with the mayors, international activists, some of the community architects and planners. And the interviews that I have done is mainly with the activists, community leaders, and also urban dwellers. And then I also able to collect informal archives, or those kind of archives that belong to the informal community, such as the community meeting notes and some documentations like the video of evictions or their protest. So then came the COVID in March. So that's after like around 8 to 9 months of fieldwork. And then there's an impositions of social distancing and lockdown. And so after that, during that times, I resorted to gather the digital archives. And I think that one of the good things of the Zoom is that some of government agencies usually conducted webinars, and when they have meetings with the activists and the community, usually it's open, so I'm able to join that. And even the informal community have Zoom meetings, so that's one good sources during the pandemic. Okay, so the implications of the pandemic and the insight that I gained from the fieldwork make me need to adjust my research design and reorient my research questions. And so I will move to what my project is standing right now. So I refocused the dissertation's topic into much more of the politics of urban informality and quite disengaged with the global city framing that I used before. And the puzzle, or this kind of shift, was actually built from the observation. So as I mentioned before, I visited different kampungs and informal settlements. And what I found was that governmental responses to these kampungs are indeed varied. So for example, in November 2019, I remember I witnessed the demolitions of informal settlements in Sunter Agung in North Jakarta. So the mayor mobilized personnel from police and public order agencies. And the dwellers told me that Anies Baswedan came to their site before the governor elections and promised them for no eviction. And so with that promise, the community became his supporters. And some of the youth told me that they even guarded the ballot box during 2017 elections. But then the removal became the signal for the people that Anies had broken the pledge. And the same events happened towards shelters in other places, in railroad tracks in Ancol and West Jakarta, and the settlement was demolished for highway constructions. So these demolitions happened even though Jakarta's new policies condemned forced evictions, and the government promoted what they call community action plan, which is like an on-site improvement and redevelopment of slums and some kampungs based on community input and planning. Several kampungs in Jakarta currently included as part of the program. So next to that evicted kampungs there's a kampung in North Jakarta also that was demolished in 2016, but now they are become the model for a new redevelopment. And then the government actually funded or facilitated the new kind of a vertical kampungs. So it's facilitated by the government and it is funded by the developers, by the private developers. While another kampungs very next to that, the Sunter Agung area also, is a kampung that's standing along the edge of the Ciliwung River. It was threatened to be demolished, but then the community able to kind of negotiate it with the government and then cancel or prevent a total demolition. And now the infrastructure improvement came to that kampung with roads and street lamps, and also becoming part of the Ciliwung River tourism development. So this varying governmental response occurred even under the same leadership, right? And I also found that it's not only during the democratic period, but also even during the authoritarian New Order period under Ali Sadikin, for example. So in other words, what is consistent is the inconsistency. Now, these observations actually negated my previous approach in the prospectus, in which I dichotomized city and I labeled them as, okay, this is exclusionary city and inclusionary city. But then the case of Jakarta suggests that the state's impulses in governing informality is actually much more diverse, much more heterogeneous. It's not only using some kind of coercive or punitive treatment, but also based on the logics of sometimes permissiveness, sometimes neglect, sometimes distributive, or sometimes accommodative to urban poor's demand. So I reframed the research questions and I made like 2 sets of questions. The first one, what factors then facilitate this governmental treatments of informality? And specifically, how does the state justify contradictory responses and maintain its authority and legitimacy in controlling access and the use of land? And the second set of questions address more of the immediate factors that influence local government's decisions. So when and why do local authorities implement a repressive approach through forced evictions, for example, rather than permissive or delaying eviction rules, or accommodative by facilitating redevelopment? And for the framework, I plan to focus on 2 factors, the institutional dimensions and the local politics. So the first is the realm of ideal norms and tools of legitimation. And specifically based on the cultural sociological approach, I look at more of the ideational and discursive dimensions of land and spatial institutions that facilitate this government inconsistencies, including law, rules, and official discourses surrounding land ownership, land use, and housing. Now, the second realm is political dimensions, in which I wanted to look at relationship between local governments and the informal community. Next, I just want to give some findings, very preliminary findings from both of these 2 factors. So I propose that the institution may authorize a converging or a univocal scheme, or they can also encourage a multivocal kind of rules and law that open for different and even contradictory interpretations. So the argument is that strategic use or abuse of these multivocal and contradictory ideas allow powerful actors to persuade the public and also to justify the inconsistent implementation. So one example of these multivocal ideas is the use of national and public interest concepts. So for example, a lot of regulations and discourses describe informal settlements and squatters as simultaneously obstacle for achieving public welfare, as well as the object of the state welfare. And sometimes these informal set dwellers also described as illegal occupiers that just wanted to gain advantage, and also the victims who need some needs of protections from the state. So the multivocal and contradictory rules become the legitimizing devices that enable government interventions that are highly dependent on local political dynamics. So at the local political dynamic side, I want to develop the concept of informal community character. And the finding is based on looking at 5 informal settlements in Jakarta, which is varied in their experiences, as I mentioned, from being evicted to getting redevelopment. And I find 3 factors that influence governmental response. The first is the degree of conflicting interest over the land, which is quite obvious. And then the second one is local leadership, both from the government side and the informal community sides, and also the informal communities' cohesions and their capacity to making strategies. The first prominent aspect is the land. So when the government and community's interests over a piece of land are not conflicted, the government tends to delay or forbear the eviction rules. But when the stakes are conflicted, it is, I argue, that the informal community's character will influence the authorities' decisions and action. So my interviews reveal the significance of the community leaders' connection, in particular with high-ranking officials, political or party elites, and urban movement activists. So some of the community coordinators that I interviewed say that they can actually WhatsApp Anies Baswedan or some of the mayors if they have a complaint or if they have some kind of demand, and they will show this WhatsApp to the other communities, and then the community will think that, okay, now use much more of the personal connection. And I also find that the cohesion between informal community leaders and the local bureaucrats really matters, especially the heads of neighborhood associations, the head of RT and RW. So for example, one activist told me that if the heads of RT and RW aren't supportive to them, it's very hard for them, for the activists to enter the kampung. And usually the conflict is more who has the spotlight, if either the RT or the informal community leaders that able to gain the infrastructure from the government. So that kind of, there's a conflict of power. If they're more supportive, if the RT and RW more supportive, usually they able to, or the kampung successfully to get the demands much faster than other kampungs. And the community cohesion is also important, as it actually, what I find is that the more cohesive kampung compared to the more fragmented community have much more community participations, and they're able to making strategies to either to avoid evictions or to demand government's commitments. And the strategies are diverse, which I won't detail here, but it's basically like a political contract with elites, legal actions, and some kind of alternative solution that they can give to the government so they can create a leverage to negotiate with the government. So those are just a very abstract findings, I think. But I hope that dissertations will able to contribute something to the urban informality literature, and especially because the approach is by disaggregating the modes of urban informality governance. It can show how the state can use multiple logics of domination to maintain their authority and legitimacy. So that's all my project right now, but then I think I want to share some of the challenge, especially and scholars in the political economy and the urbanists. So do you think that this is new, or there's something new that I can develop from this? And also like the transferability of the work, should I like compare other cities? And if you have any suggestions which cities that I look at that will be helpful. So that's all, and any impressions or comments about my project from the perspectives to the current state will be very helpful. And thank you so much.
Wara. Please, if anyone has questions, please raise your hand and we'll call on you, or type a question in the chat. Looks like Dika has a question. Dika, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Wara, for sharing your ongoing project with us. Also, I'm a big fan of your work too, and it's been very exciting to me to follow along how the ideas developed since a couple of years back. I do think that your research really important in a way that contributing to sociology of culture by bringing in the politics, not only from the bottom up, but also from the top-down perspective. Because sometimes political dimensions are missing from a lot of study of sociology of culture. In that sense, I'm just wondering if you could elaborate further the idea of how this diversifying of the urban governance on informality being influenced by the politics, not only the politics at the below, but the electoral politics in general. Since we know during the Jakarta governor elections, transitioning from Ahok to Anies, we saw that this governance of informal settlements, they were being highlighted in national media, and it seems like there are different kind of responses and approaches and representations in the media of how that goes in these two different governorial regimes and surrounding the elections. And the other things that I'm really curious about is how politics really affect the community cohesiveness that you mentioned earlier. Whether community cohesiveness at the ground, they were really contingent upon what kind of political atmosphere during that period of time. Whether if during the elections, people in the community that has a different political allegiance, they had like different ideas and contending interests in terms of advocating or proposing the idea about responding to the urban informality resettlement. And so, but I think this is a fascinating work, and I'm looking forward to engage further with your research, and congratulations for doing that till this point and make it this far. Thank you.
Thank you, Dika. Thanks, Dika. Let's collect one more question. Clara.
Hi, Wara. How are you?
Hi, Clara. Yeah.
Can everyone hear me right? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, congratulations to that you are able to move on to this very exciting analysis phase. And I think I can already see some of the insights that I can sort of borrow for my own project from what you have lined out just now. My question would be, I'm aware that you are sort of focusing on some kampungs that are part of the urban poor consortiums. So not all informal kampung are part of the organizations, but I wonder if you can also sort of like making a comparative notes with some other kampung that have their own movement, probably before Anies Baswedan came into power. So one example on top of my head would be Ciliwung Merdeka and Bukit Duri Kampung, because they also organized, they also had, you know, connections and network with very influential figure, but it was quite a different result. I know that the case is still going on, and I haven't really heard about it, about any progress after that, but that would be, I think, kind of like would give you a more, you know, I would say landing pad to see you know, what really is the key factor in the advocacy of the urban poor.
Okay. Thank you, Clara.
Thank you.
Should I answer?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so thank you, Dika, for your insight and for the questions. Yeah, I think that because, yeah, we come from like the sociology of culture as well, and bringing this one of the prominent theory, the multivocality, into an institutions that also, you know, I think they are part of my goal in trying to make the multivocal theory into more of a political realm. And for the electoral politics, yeah, and I think the relationship between the electoral politics and urban informality governance, I think it's really important, because when I found we can actually create a hypothesis in which that the governmental treatments, the permissiveness, and the way that they try to cancel eviction rules, although that's actually the policies, you know, that the slums needs to be demolished, is actually part of the informal welfare to gain electoral votes. And that happens, actually, that's really clear in Jakarta's case, right? All the political contract made by the communities and even by the urban poor consortiums and a lot of urban activists actually try to develop that kind of patterns in which, okay, we give you votes, but then promise no evictions, make the community action plan. So that's kind of an important stage even for the informal community to be able to reach the formal institution, and they able to do that, right? The community action plan and the programs was actually initiated by the activists and the informal community, but then established at the formal level. But then I also want to actually compare this with the authoritarian new order, because the variations also there. So yes, electoral votes matters, but then why during non-elections, these kind of variations also happen. I don't really have the answer for that, but we see the same pattern. So I think that I need to check how powerful is actually the electoral votes, influencing the decision. And then the role of politics in influencing community cohesiveness. I think that the kampungs that I actually observe quite homogeneous in whom they choose. Because of that, again, the settings are during these times, and settings is like one candidate brave enough to promise them certain things, right? So from what I found now, most of the political orientations of the kampungs oriented to certain candidates and certain political party. So actually that matters because it's more of the patron client. So we have this kind of demands, and only this party politics really show that they're willing to do that. So I think that it matters, but I also found that in one kampung, usually at the first, there are separated supporters. One is for certain party, the other one is the other party. But somehow it's actually resulted in the community leaders who supported the other party to leave the kampung. So yeah, there's a fight on that, and the cohesiveness is built. That's what I'm saying. Even in the choosing of community leaders or community coordinators and the head of RT and RW, usually the powerful persons will think that, okay, choose this guy as the RT and RW because I can control them. So it is made. It's not really, something really organic. So I think I hope it answers. I mean, this is really good factors that I will look at later. And for Clara's questions, the comparisons between those kampungs with urban poor consortiums and other movements. Yeah, I think that for now, the kampungs that work or have a network with urban poor consortiums really showing a much better result than those kampungs that don't really have the connections with them, especially because the UPC have a very good connections with the governors. But then also among those kampungs that affiliated with urban poor consortiums, the result is actually quite varied. So not all kampungs able to just as fast as Kampung Aquarium, for example, to ask something or being redeveloped. Some kampungs were demolished still, and really hard for them to connect to the mayors, and there's sustained jealousy among the kampungs. So that's what I found. So even under the same kind of network situations, informal community character matters, and that's how I choose like which kampungs that I looking at. But then again, your idea of comparing Ciliwung Merdeka, the kind of different movements and how their activisms kind of quite stuck, right? Compared to those in urban poor consortiums is really important. For now, I think that they have a lot of secondary sources on that. People work on Ciliwung Merdeka quite a lot, and I think that I can get some insights for that. Yeah, I think, do I answer all of your questions, Clara?
Oh yeah, it was just suggestions. I mean, it would be lovely if you can have some comparative notes on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that in any way that in the dissertations, I have to mention about Ciliwung Merdeka. That's one of the pioneers in urban poor movement. So thank you for the suggestions.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. First of all, to all of our participants, thank you so much for attending this 9th Arryman Symposium. Thanks also to our presenters today. All of you have really put on the front burner for us important topics. We're really excited about the material you're engaging, the questions you're asking, and the insights you're giving us. So thank you very much for that. All of the projects are very stimulating. And all we can say is semangat and keep going in your work, especially for those who are wrapping up. To Gde, who is done with the dissertation and now is working on the book version. Godspeed to you, if I may say, in doing that. And so that's it. I want one more time to thank Beth for moderating. I want to thank Pa Irfan for representing ESRSF. We had many of the board members here. It's late night for all of you in Asia right now. Usually at this point, whether it's the Arryman Symposium in Evanston or when we're doing it in Indonesia, we eat and we have a nice meal together. We're not able to do that right now together, but we promise next year we're back to our regular way of doing it. And we look forward to seeing you in Evanston and wherever we are in Indonesia in the coming year. So with that, thank you to everyone. We feel it's very successful and on to the 10th Arryman Symposium coming up next year. All right, everyone. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jeff and Beth.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Beth, thank you, Jeff.
Bye.
Thank you, Pak Irfan.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jeff.
Terima kasih
And
semua.
thank you, Rudolph. Rudolph,
Oh,
thank
there's
you,
Rudolph.
There's Rudolph.
Yeah, Professor Mrazek is here.
Hi, Rudy. Professor Mrazek.